Dear listener, settle yourself now into comfort and calm. Let the weight of the day drift away like morning mist over the Scottish Highlands and allow yourself to be carried into a story. A story of magic, yes, but more than that, a story of love, of partnership, of finding one's place in a world that never quite turns out the way we imagined. Tonight, we journey into the life of Ronald Bilious Weasley, a man whose name is known throughout the wizarding world, not for the battles he fought, though he fought many, not for the dark wizards he captured, though he captured some, but for something far more profound. We will follow the path of a boy who grew up believing he would always be overshadowed, who discovered that his greatest strength lay not in standing in the spotlight, but in standing steadfast beside the woman he loved as she changed their world forever. This is the story of the Muggle-born Minister's husband, told gently, soothingly, as the candles burn low, and thus, enchanted ceiling above mirrors the peaceful stars. Let your breathing slow, dear listener, and let us begin where all the best stories begin. At the very beginning, in a place filled with warmth and laughter and the particular chaos that only a family of redheads can create. In the rolling hills of Devon, where Muggle farmland meets the hidden corners of the wizarding world, there stood a house that shouldn't have been able to stand at all. The burrow, home to the Weasley family, rose into the sky like a cheerful rebellion against the laws of physics and architecture, held together by magic and love in equal measure. It was here, in this gloriously ramshackle sanctuary, that Ronald Weasley was born on the 1st of March, 1980, the 6th son in a family where being extraordinary was almost impossible, because everyone around you already was. From his very first breath, Ron was surrounded by noise and motion, and the particular kind of affection that comes from being part of something larger than oneself. His mother Molly held him close on that March evening, her heart swelling with the same fierce love she'd felt for each of her children, while his father, Arthur, looked on with wonder that such a small thing could contain so much promise. Above them, the enchanted clock on the wall ticked peacefully, adding one more hand to its face, one more beloved soul to keep track of, one more source of worry and pride. Ron's childhood unfolded in a cascade of hand-me-down robes and shared bedrooms, of garden denoming competitions and Quidditch matches in the orchard. He learned early what it meant to be overlooked, not through any lack of love, but simply through the mathematics of being number 6. Bill was brilliant and brave, already breaking curses in Egypt. Charlie was off with dragons in Romania. Percy was perfect and ambitious, his head boy badge polished to an unbearable shine. Fred and George were a matched set of mischief and genius, impossible to separate, impossible to ignore. And then there was Ron, tall and gangly, with freckles scattered across his nose like constellations, and a temper that flared bright and quick like the red of his hair. He was funny. Yes, fiercely loyal, absolutely. But in the quiet moments of his childhood, lying in the bedroom he shared with his brothers, Ron couldn't help but wonder what made him special, what made him necessary in a world that seemed full to bursting with more talented people. Magic, when it came to him, was as natural as breathing. He'd known nothing else after all. The burrow hummed with enchantment, self-knitting needles clicking in the corner, dishes washing themselves in the sink, his mother's wand stirring 3 pots at once while she scolded someone, usually him or the twins, for tracking mud through the kitchen. But Ron's magic was steady, rather than spectacular, reliable rather than remarkable. He could do what needed doing, but he didn't make the windows rattle or turn the cat yellow by accident like his brothers had. Still, there was happiness in those early years, deep, uncomplicated happiness. Summer evenings playing Quidditch until the sky turned purple and his mother called them in for dinner. Winter mornings, waking to find snow covering the crooked house, like icing on a lopsided cake. The smell of his mother's cooking, the sound of his father's voice explaining some fascinating Muggle contraption, the warmth of being part of a family that, for all its chaos, loved fiercely and completely. When his Hogwarts letter arrived, delivered by the family owl with characteristic poor timing during breakfast, Ron felt the familiar mix of excitement and anxiety that had become his constant companion. 5 of his brothers had gone before him. 5 sets of expectations, 5 legacies to live up to, or fail to match. The Sorting Hat would place him in Gryffindor, of course. All Weasleys went to Gryffindor. But what then? Would he be brave enough, clever enough, special enough? The train to Hogwarts on September 1st, 1991, changed everything, though Ron didn't know it at the time. Sitting in a compartment with a boy who had impossibly messy hair and the saddest green eyes Ron had ever seen, sharing chocolate frogs and Bertie Bott's every flavour beans, Ron Weasley made his first real friend, someone who chose him not because they were related, but simply because they liked him. Harry Potter, the famous Harry Potter, wanted to be his friend. And then she came into the compartment, all bushy hair and earnest intensity, asking if they'd seen a toad. Hermione Granger. Ron thought she was the most insufferable know-it-all he'd ever encountered, and said as much, a comment he would regret and apologize for many times over the years to come. She thought he was an immature, insensitive boy who needed to learn some manners. Neither of them could have known, in that moment, that they were meeting the person they would one day promise to love for the rest of their lives. The years at Hogwarts passed in a blur of adventure and danger, of growing up faster than they should have had to. Ron stood by Harry through everything, through basilisks and time-turners, through tournaments and prophecies, through betrayals and losses that carved pieces out of all of them. And Hermione was there too, always, the 3 of them forming a bond that went deeper than friendship, that became something like family, forged by choice rather than blood. Ron learned many things in those years. He learned that bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but acting despite it. He learned that he could be clever in ways that didn't involve memorizing textbooks, clever in strategy, in understanding people, in knowing when to fight and when to make someone laugh. He learned that love could be many things. The comfortable affection of long friendship, the fierce protectiveness of family, and something else, something that grew slowly and inevitably between him and the girl with the bushy hair who turned out to be so much more than a know-it-all. The war came, as they'd always known it would. Voldemort rose, and the wizarding world descended into darkness and fear. Ron was 17 when he left the burrow to hunt Horcruxes with Harry and Hermione, knowing he might never come home again. Those months in the wilderness, cold and hungry and terrified, tested everything he thought he knew about himself. There were moments of weakness, moments when the darkness pressed in so close that he couldn't see clearly, when jealousy and fear made him lash out and leave, abandoning his best friends when they needed him most. But he came back. That was what mattered. He came back, and he saved Harry's life, and he destroyed a Horcrux that had fed on his deepest insecurities. He came back, and in the depths of a war-torn world, he finally kissed Hermione Granger in a corridor beneath Hogwarts, and knew with absolute certainty that this was the person he wanted beside him for whatever time he had left. The Battle of Hogwarts took pieces of all of them. Ron fought with everything he had, defended his family and his friends, and watched his brother Fred die in an explosion that seemed to shatter something fundamental in the universe. The grief was enormous, impossible to contain, but they survived. Against all odds, they survived. In the aftermath, as the wizarding world began the slow process of healing, Ron found himself adrift. Harry joined the Auror office, began the work of catching the Death Eaters who'd escaped justice. Hermione, characteristically, threw herself into ensuring that what had happened could never happen again. First, helping to track down missing Muggle-borns, then returning to Hogwarts to complete her education. Of course she did. Then, accepting a position at the Ministry in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, determined to change laws that had allowed so much discrimination, and suffering. And Ron. Ron joined the Aurors too, because it seemed like the thing to do, because Harry was doing it, because people expected it of war heroes. The training was brutal, but he was good at it. Good at defensive magic, good at thinking on his feet, good at having his partner's back. For a while, it was enough. He and Hermione dated through those early years, though dating seemed too simple a word for what they were to each other. They'd seen each other at their worst and their best, had saved each other's lives more than once, had weathered losses that would have broken lesser bonds. When Ron proposed, on a quiet evening at the Burrow, nothing fancy, just the two of them in the garden where he'd played Quidditch as a boy, Hermione said yes before he'd even finished the question. Their wedding was everything they needed it to be, small, intimate, held at the Burrow with only family and their closest friends. Hermione wore her mother's veil transfigured to fit, and Ron wore dress robes that were actually new, bought with his own money from his Auror salary. Harry was his best man, of course, and Ginny stood beside Hermione. And when Hermione walked toward him through the garden, the late afternoon sun turning her hair to amber and gold, Ron felt his throat close with the overwhelming rightness of it all. This was where he belonged, not in the shadow of anyone's fame, not trying to live up to impossible standards, but here, beside this brilliant, impossible, wonderful woman who'd chosen him too. They moved into a modest flat in London, close enough to the Ministry for both of them to flew to work, and began the intricate dance of building a life together. It wasn't always easy. They still argued, still pushed each other's buttons with the ease of long familiarity. But beneath it all was bedrock, was certainty, was home. When Hermione told him she was pregnant, Ron felt the world shift beneath his feet in the best possible way. Rose Granger Weasley arrived on a spring morning, tiny and perfect and terrifying, and Ron held his daughter and felt his heart expand in ways he hadn't known were possible. 2 years later, Hugo completed their family, and Ron discovered that all the love he'd thought he'd maxed out with Rose simply grew to encompass this small, red-haired boy who already showed signs of having his grandmother Molly's stubborn streak. Hermione, even on maternity leave, was still Hermione, reading ministry reports while nursing, drafting policy proposals during nap time. She'd already started making waves at the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, pushing through the first real protections for house elves in centuries, advocating for better treatment of part humans in magical society. Ron watched her passion and brilliance with awe and pride, even as he juggled bottles and nappies and tried to remember when either of them had last slept, more than 4 hours straight. Those early years of parenthood were a blur of joy and exhaustion, of learning to be partners not just to each other, but to these small people who depended on them completely. Ron discovered that he loved being a father, loved the bedtime stories and the sticky hugs, loved teaching Rose to fly a toy broomstick in the garden, loved the way Hugo's face lit up when Ron came home from work. But something was shifting, slowly, inevitably. Hermione's star was rising at the Ministry. Her reforms were working, her reputation growing. She was promoted to magical law enforcement, her portfolio expanding to include everything from the rewriting of discriminatory laws to the reform of Azkaban. She was brilliant at it, and the wizarding world was starting to notice. And Ron was proud, fiercely, genuinely proud. But late at night, when he came home from long aura shifts to find Hermione still at her desk, surrounded by reports and proposals, their children already asleep, he felt the first whispers of something he couldn't quite name. Not jealousy, exactly. Something more complicated. A sense that their paths, which had run parallel for so long, were beginning to diverge. The foundation of their partnership was strong, built on years of friendship and tested by trials most couples would never face. But foundations, Ron was learning, needed to be tended, adapted, strengthened as the structure built upon them grew and changed. Little did he know, dear listener, that the greatest test of that foundation and the greatest opportunity to discover who he truly was still lay ahead. But that is a story for another chapter. For now, let us rest here in this moment of peace. Ron and Hermione and their young children, a family built on love and trust, standing on the edge of a future neither of them could yet fully see. The morning Hermione came home with news of her promotion to Deputy Head of Magical Law Enforcement, Ron was in the kitchen of their London flat, attempting to convince Hugo that porridge was not, in fact, a punishment invented by cruel parents. Rose, now 5 and showing alarming signs of having inherited her mother's determination, was reading a picture book that was probably too advanced for her age, occasionally correcting the illustrations when they didn't match the text. Hermione burst through the flue in a shower of green flames and excitement, her eyes bright with the particular kind of joy that came from professional achievement. "They offered it to me," she said, barely pausing to brush the soot from her robes. "Deputy Head. Ron, they actually offered it to me." Ron stood, crossed the kitchen in 2 strides, and pulled her into a hug, lifting her off her feet despite her laughing protests. "Of course they did," he said, meaning it completely. "You're brilliant. They'd be mad not to." And he was proud, genuinely, deeply proud. He spent that evening listening to her talk about the scope of the position, the reforms she could implement, the changes she could make to a system that had been broken for so long. He watched her sketch out plans and possibilities, saw the fire in her eyes that had first drawn him to her all those years ago at Hogwarts, and felt nothing but admiration. But later, after Hermione had gone to bed, Ron sat alone in their small living room, a half-empty cup of tea cooling in his hands, and felt the weight of something he couldn't quite name settling on his shoulders. The deputy head of magical law enforcement. It was enormous. It was important. It was everything Hermione deserved, and more. And what was he? An aura. A good one, certainly. Competent, reliable, but nothing special. Nothing that would change the wizarding world or be remembered in history books. Just Ron Weasley, doing his job, coming home, being Harry Potter's best friend and Hermione Granger's husband. The thought shamed him as soon as it formed. This wasn't about him. This was Hermione's moment, Hermione's achievement. He pushed the feeling down, deep down where it couldn't hurt anyone, and went to bed. The months that followed were an adjustment for all of them. Hermione's new position demanded more time, more travel, more late nights at the office. Ron found himself taking on more of the domestic responsibilities, collecting the children from the Weasley cousins who watched them during the day, managing bedtimes and bath times, and the 1,000 small crises that came with raising young children. He didn't mind, not really. He loved his children with a fierceness that sometimes surprised him, loved the sticky-fingered hugs and the nonsensical conversations, and the way Rose would climb into his lap and demand he read her favourite story for the 100th time. But there were moments, standing in the ministry cafeteria with other auras who talked about cases and captures, or watching Harry discuss strategy with the head of the department, when Ron felt something crumbling inside him. Some sense of purpose, slowly eroding like stone under water. The mission that changed everything came on a cold Tuesday in November. Ron and his partner were tracking a former Death Eater. Nothing too dangerous, routine really. But something went wrong. A tip that turned out to be false. An ambush in a dark alley in Nocturne Alley. Curses flying in the darkness. Ron defended himself well, fought his way out, came home with nothing worse than a bruised rib and a torn cloak. But that night, holding Hugo while the boy slept peacefully against his chest, Ron felt his hands shaking. Not from fear, exactly. From something else. From the sudden, crystalline realization that he didn't want to do this anymore. That he was doing it because it was what was expected, because it was what war heroes did, because it gave him an identity that people respected. But it wasn't making him happy. The conversation with Hermione happened late one night, both of them exhausted, the children finally asleep after Hugo had insisted there were nifflers under his bed. Ron had been trying to find the words for weeks, and they came out clumsily, as his words often did. "I'm thinking of leaving the Aura office," he said, not looking at her, focusing instead on the cup of tea he was methodically stirring. Hermione went very still. Because of the ambush? No. Yes. Sort of. Ron set down his spoon, forced himself to meet her eyes. "I'm not happy, Hermione. I haven't been happy there for a while. I'm good at it, I think. But I don't love it. And every time I go out on a mission now, all I can think about is what happens to Rose and Hugo if I don't come back. What happens to you?" "Ron, let me finish. Please." He took a breath. "You love your work. I can see it every day. You come home excited about policy changes and legal reforms, and you're making a real difference. You're changing things that need to be changed. And I'm so proud of you for that. But I can't keep doing something just because it sounds impressive or because people expect it. I need to find something that's mine." Hermione reached across the table, took his hand in both of hers. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. "What do you want to do?" And that was it, wasn't it? The question he'd been avoiding. Ron thought about the things that made him happy. Really, genuinely happy. Making his children laugh. The rare afternoons when he could stop by Weasley's Wizard Wheezes and help George with inventory, the two of them falling into the old, easy rhythm of joke and counter-joke. The feeling of lightness, of joy, of making people smile. "I want to go back and help George," he said quietly. "At the shop. He's been running it alone since Fred, and it's too much for one person. I'm good at it, Hermione. I'm good at making people laugh, at testing products, at talking to customers. It doesn't sound as important as being an aura. I know—" "Stop," Hermione said firmly. "Stop right there. Bringing joy to people, making them laugh, helping your brother. That is important, Ron. Just as important as catching dark wizards. Maybe more important, actually. The world needs laughter. It needs places of light and happiness, especially after everything we've been through. But the money. We'll be fine. My salary is more than enough, and George will pay you fairly. That's not what this is about." She squeezed his hands. "Ron, I love you. I love that you're brave enough to admit when something isn't working. I love that you want to do something that makes you happy. Please don't ever think you need to be anyone other than who you are." Ron felt something loosening in his chest, some knot of tension he'd been carrying for months unwinding. "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." The decision made, Ron handed in his resignation the following week. His supervisor was understanding, even kind, but Ron didn't miss the slightly disappointed look in the man's eyes, as if Ron was squandering some great potential. Harry, thank Merlin, was completely supportive, even enthusiastic. "Mate, if I could get away with leaving, I might join you," Harry said over drinks at the Leaky Cauldron. "But someone has to stay and keep this lot in order. You go be happy. You deserve it." The reaction from the rest of the Weasley family was mixed. Molly cried, though whether from relief that her son wouldn't be in danger anymore, or disappointment that he was giving up such a prestigious position, Ron couldn't quite tell. Arthur gave him a long, searching look, then pulled him into a hug and whispered, "Proud of you, son. Takes more courage to choose your own path than to follow the expected one." Bill and Charlie sent letters of support. Percy, predictably, sent a 3-page missive about the importance of career planning and not making rash decisions, which Ron read once and then used to light the fireplace. Ginny, now playing professionally for the Holyhead Harpies, just grinned and said, "About time you figured out what you wanted." But it was George's reaction that meant the most. Ron went to the shop on a quiet afternoon, climbed the stairs to the office where George was doing paperwork, something Fred would have found hilarious, and simply said, "I'm done with the auras. If you still need help." George looked up, and for a moment Ron saw such raw relief and gratitude in his brother's face that he almost couldn't breathe. "I thought you'd never ask," George said, his voice rough. "When can you start?" "Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow it is." Returning to Weasley's Wizard Wheezes felt like coming home in a way Ron hadn't expected. The shop was thriving. George had kept it going through sheer determination, creating new products, maintaining the legacy that he and Fred had built. But there were cracks showing too. George was tired, spread too thin, and the spark of mischief that had always defined the twins was dimmed. Ron threw himself into the work with an enthusiasm that surprised him. He helped with inventory, served customers, tested new products, sometimes with hilarious and occasionally painful results. He brought ideas to George, drew on his aura training to improve their security products, used his natural charm to build relationships with suppliers and shop owners. And slowly, gradually, he watched George come back to life. The shop became a place of light again, of laughter. Children pressed their faces against the windows. Parents emerged with bags full of joke wands and extendable ears and portable swamps. Ron would come home to Hermione with stories of the day's mishaps and triumphs, and find himself genuinely happy in a way he hadn't been in years. But the transition wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when Ron would meet old colleagues from the Auror office, see the carefully neutral expressions on their faces, when he mentioned he was working at a joke shop. There were family dinners, where well-meaning relatives would ask how the little shop was doing, as if it were a hobby, rather than a thriving business. There were evenings when he'd read the Daily Prophet and see Harry's name mentioned for some heroic capture, and feel a small, shameful twist of envy. And there were the whispers, quiet, insidious, that began when people saw him out with Hermione. That's Ron Weasley, isn't it? Hermione Granger's husband, left the Auras to work at his brother's shop. Bit of a step down, don't you think? Hermione's career, meanwhile, continued to accelerate. She was brilliant at her job, implementing reforms at a pace that left the old guard of the ministry reeling. She pushed through legislation protecting the rights of part humans, reformed hiring practices to eliminate blood status discrimination, restructured the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures entirely. Her days grew longer, her responsibilities heavier. Ron supported her, always. He took pride in her achievements, defended her reforms when people questioned them. But he'd be lying to himself if he said it was always easy. There were evenings when he'd have the children bathed and fed and in bed by the time Hermione got home, and she'd be so exhausted she could barely speak. There were mornings when she'd leave before the children woke up. Important meetings that couldn't be rescheduled. Their first real argument about it came on Hugo's 3rd birthday. Hermione had promised to be home by noon for the small party. Just family, nothing elaborate. But noon came and went. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. Hugo kept asking where Mummy was, his little face crumpling with disappointment, and Ron felt anger building in his chest, like steam in a kettle. She finally arrived at 3:30, breathless and apologetic. An emergency meeting, a crisis she couldn't have predicted. So sorry. She'd make it up to Hugo. "You promised him," Ron said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "You promised, Hermione." And he waited and waited, and I had to watch his face every time the flu activated, and it wasn't you. "I know. I'm so sorry. The meeting was about the new werewolf legislation, and if we didn't vote today..." "There's always going to be something more important, isn't there?" The words came out harder than he'd intended. "There's always going to be one more meeting, one more crisis, one more thing that matters more than being here." Hermione's face went pale, then flushed with anger. "That's not fair, Ron. You know how important this work is. You know what these reforms mean for people who've been discriminated against for centuries." "I do know. And I support you. I always support you. But our son is 3 years old, Hermione. He doesn't understand legislative schedules or political crises. He just knows his mum wasn't there when she said she would be. They argued for an hour, voices rising and falling, old resentments and new fears bubbling to the surface. It was Ginny, who'd stayed to help with the party, who finally intervened, sending them both to separate corners to cool down like the children they were acting like. Later, after the guests had left and the children were asleep, Ron and Hermione sat together on the sofa, their anger burned out, leaving only exhaustion and sadness. "I don't know how to do this," Hermione said quietly, her head on Ron's shoulder. "I don't know how to be the person I want to be at work and the mother I want to be at home. There aren't enough hours in the day." "I know," Ron said, his arm around her. "I'm sorry I got angry. I see you stretching yourself so thin, and I worry. About you, about us, about what we're teaching Rose and Hugo about what matters. What do we do?" Ron was quiet for a long moment, thinking. "We talk about it. Really talk about it. We figure out what we can compromise on and what we can't. We set boundaries. Real ones, not just ones we say we'll set. And then ignore. And we remember that we're on the same team, even when it doesn't feel like it." It wasn't a perfect solution. There would be more missed dinners, more difficult conversations, more moments of frustration on both sides. But it was a start. A recognition that the life they were building required conscious effort, required choosing each other again and again, even when it was hard. Ron also started taking on part-time work with the ministry, small projects that played to his strengths. Hermione recommended him for initiatives that needed someone who could talk to ordinary witches and wizards, who could explain complex policies in plain language, who could build bridges between the ministry and the magical community. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was meaningful, and it helped him feel connected to something larger than himself. But even as he found his footing, even as he built his own identity, separate from Harry's friend or Hermione's husband, there were challenges he couldn't quite articulate. Walking through Diagon Alley with Hermione, watching people's eyes slide past him to focus on her. Attending ministry functions where he was introduced as Minister Granger's husband before anyone asked his name. Reading articles in the Daily Prophet about Hermione's latest triumph and being mentioned only in passing, if at all. It was George, surprisingly, who helped him find perspective. They were closing up the shop one evening, Ron venting his frustrations over butterbeers in the back room. "You know what Fred used to say?" George asked, his voice thoughtful. "He used to say that we were like a two-person firework, both parts necessary, but only one part visible in the explosion. Didn't make the other part any less important. That's different. You and Fred were equals." "Were we?" George raised an eyebrow. "I was always the quieter one, the one who did the books while Fred charmed the customers. People remembered Fred's jokes, not mine, but the business wouldn't have worked without both of us. You're doing the same thing with Hermione, Ron. You're the foundation that lets her soar. That's not diminishment, that's partnership." Ron considered this, turning the bottle in his hands. "I just don't want to lose myself, you know. Don't want to wake up one day and realize I'm nothing but someone's husband, someone's brother, someone's friend. Then don't. Keep finding things that are yours. The shop, your ministry projects, being a father, and you're a bloody brilliant father, by the way. But also recognize that choosing to support someone you love isn't weakness, it's strength. It's choosing what matters most." The words settled into Ron like seeds, taking root. He wasn't there yet, wasn't quite at peace with the path his life had taken. But he was getting closer. And he was learning that identity wasn't fixed, wasn't something you achieved and then possessed forever. It was something you built, day by day, choice by choice. What Ron didn't know yet, dear listener, as the seasons turned and his children grew and Hermione's star continued to rise, was that his greatest test and his greatest triumph still lay ahead. The wizarding world was about to change in ways none of them could predict, and Ron would need every ounce of the strength and self-knowledge he was building. But that, as the embers die down in the grate and the stars wheel slowly overhead, is a tale for our next chapter. For now, let us rest in this moment of hard-won understanding, of a man learning to be comfortable in his own skin, even when the world wanted to define him by his relationships to others. The morning the Daily Prophet published the headline, "Granger's Radical Reforms, Tradition Under Threat," Ron was making breakfast while Rose practiced her letters at the kitchen table, and Hugo built an increasingly unstable tower of wooden blocks. Hermione came through the flue earlier than usual, her face tight with controlled anger, the newspaper clenched in her fist. "They're calling me a radical," she said without preamble, tossing the paper onto the table, as if wanting house elves to have basic rights and part humans to be treated with dignity is somehow extremist. Ron scanned the article, his jaw tightening with each paragraph. The piece was cleverly written, not outright hostile, but dripping with insinuation. It questioned whether someone with Hermione's limited understanding of traditional magical culture should be making such sweeping changes. It quoted unnamed ministry officials expressing concern about the pace of reform. It referenced her Muggle-born status 3 times in the first 5 paragraphs alone, each mention like a barb carefully placed. "It's rubbish," Ron said flatly. "Complete rubbish. Everyone knows you're the best thing that's happened to the ministry in decades." "Not everyone," Hermione said quietly, sinking into a chair. She looked exhausted, and Ron realized she'd probably been up half the night reading early copies of the paper, preparing for the backlash. "There are people who've been fighting me every step of the way. Old families who don't like seeing their privileges questioned, officials who've built careers on the old system, and now they're going to the press." She was right, of course. Hermione was always right about these things. But Ron hated the defeated slump of her shoulders, the way her usual fire seemed dimmed. He crossed to her, placed his hands on her shoulders, and squeezed gently. "Then we fight back," he said simply. "We show them you're not backing down." And fight they did, though the battle lines were drawn in whispers and pointed looks rather than wands and curses. Hermione had been promoted again. She was now Senior Undersecretary for Magical Law, her portfolio encompassing nearly every aspect of the ministry's legal framework. Her reforms were comprehensive, systematic, and deeply threatening to those who'd benefited from the status quo. The resistance started subtly. Proposals that should have sailed through committee meetings were suddenly tabled for further study. Memos went missing. Meetings were scheduled and then mysteriously cancelled. Hermione came home night after night, frustrated by the bureaucratic obstacles being thrown in her path, obstacles that seemed designed not to stop her outright, but to slow her down, wear her down, make her give up. Ron watched it all with growing anger. He saw the toll it took on Hermione, the late nights, The tension in her shoulders, the way she'd sit at the dinner table, pushing food around her plate, lost in thought about some political maneuver or counter-strategy. He saw the way it affected their children too. Rose, now 7, and frighteningly perceptive, had started asking why some of her friends' parents didn't like Mummy's job. The first time Ron had to defend Hermione in public was at the Leaky Cauldron, of all places. He'd stopped in after work for a quiet pint, looking forward to unwinding after a long day at the shop. A group of wizards at the next table were deep in conversation, their voices carrying over the general tavern noise. Granger and her crusade against tradition, one of them was saying, a portly wizard with elaborate robes that screamed old money. My family has employed house elves for 6 generations, and they've always been perfectly content. But now this Muggle-born upstart thinks she knows better. Ron's hand tightened on his glass. He tried to ignore it, tried to remember that people were entitled to their opinions, even ignorant ones. Heard she's pushing for werewolves to be allowed in ministry positions next. As if we haven't had enough problems with dark creatures. They're not dark creatures, Ron said, his voice cutting through the conversation like a knife. They're people. People who happen to have a condition they can't control. The portly wizard turned, his face flushing when he recognized Ron. Weasley, should have known you'd defend her. But then, you married her, didn't you? Suppose you have to. Ron stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He wasn't a small man. Years of aura training and hauling inventory at the shop had kept him fit and strong. When he wanted to, he could be intimidating. "That's my wife you're talking about," he said quietly, dangerously. "And she's not an upstart. She's not a radical. She's someone who believes that all magical beings deserve basic dignity and rights. If that threatens you, maybe you should ask yourself why." "Now see here." "No, you see here." Ron's voice was steel. Hermione Granger fought in the war when half the purebloods in this country were hiding or collaborating with Voldemort. Several people flinched at the name, but Ron kept going. She's the brightest witch of her generation, and she's using that brilliance to make our world better. If you can't see that, if all you can see is her blood, status, then you're exactly the kind of person she's trying to protect people from. He threw some coins on the table and walked out, his heart pounding, hands shaking slightly with adrenaline. It was only when he was halfway home that he realized he'd just made a scene, probably made things harder for Hermione. But when he told her about it that night, she pulled him into a fierce hug and held him tight. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for defending me." "Always," Ron said simply, and meant it with every fibre of his being. But the Leaky Cauldron was just the beginning. The opposition to Hermione's reforms grew more organized, more vocal. A group calling themselves the Committee for Traditional Magical Values began holding rallies in Diagon Alley, their rhetoric carefully coded, but their meaning clear. They wanted things to go back to the way they were, when blood status mattered and Muggle-borns knew their place. Ron found himself defending Hermione everywhere. Quidditch matches, where he'd overhear snide comments in the stands. At family gatherings, where even some distant Weasley relations questioned whether Hermione was moving too fast. In the shops of Diagon Alley, where proprietors would make pointed comments about how things used to be done. Each time, Ron felt his temper flare, felt the old familiar anger that came from seeing someone he loved being attacked. But he learned, gradually, to channel that anger into something more effective than just shouting. He learned to argue calmly, to cite facts, to tell stories about the people Hermione's reforms were helping. He learned to be Hermione's advocate in the places she couldn't be, among the ordinary witches and wizards who might never interact with ministry policy directly, but whose opinions mattered nonetheless. The anonymous letters started arriving in March, slipped under their door, or delivered by owls that disappeared before they could be identified. Most were just hateful, calling Hermione a mudblood, threatening her career, promising that real wizards would put her in her place. Ron and Hermione had dealt with hate mail before. It was an unfortunate reality of public life. But then, the letters started mentioning the children. Your daughter looks lovely in her blue coat. Such a pretty target. Ron read that one alone in his study, his hands shaking so badly he had to set it down. Rose had worn her blue coat to the park just yesterday. Someone had been watching. Someone had been close enough to see what colour coat his 7-year-old daughter was wearing. The argument that night was one of the worst they'd ever had. Ron wanted increased security, wanted Ottawa protection for the children, wanted to pull them out of their usual activities until the threats could be traced. Hermione agreed to some measures, but pushed back against others, arguing that they couldn't let fear control their lives, couldn't let the children grow up in a cage of protection. They're targeting our children, Hermione. Ron's voice was raw with fear and fury. They're threatening Rose and Hugo because they can't get to you directly. How can you be calm about this? I'm not calm, Hermione shot back, her own composure cracking. I'm terrified. But if we hide, if we stop living our lives, they win. They make us afraid, and that fear is what they want. I don't care about winning or losing some political battle. I care about keeping our children safe. So do I, Hermione's voice broke. Do you think I don't lie awake at night thinking about every terrible thing that could happen? Do you think I don't question whether I should just resign, give up, make it all stop? Ron stared at her, seeing the tears streaming down her face, the real terror beneath her logical arguments. He crossed to her in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. Don't resign, he said roughly. Don't let them win. But please, Hermione, please let me protect you. Protect them. Let me do something. They compromised, as they always eventually did. Increased security around the house, discreet aura surveillance when the children were out, defensive spells and wards that Ron insisted on reinforcing personally. But they didn't hide. They didn't stop living. The protests came to the ministry in June, organised by the Committee for Traditional Magical Values. Hundreds of wizards and witches gathered in the atrium, their signs and chants echoing off the marble floors. Ron, who'd been at the ministry consulting on a community outreach program, found himself in the middle of it. The signs were vicious. Keep magic pure. Granger, go home. Tradition, not treason. Ron felt his blood boil, felt his wand hand twitch. But he remembered Hermione's words from breakfast that morning. Let them protest. Let them show who they really are. We'll show them who we are by not backing down. So Ron stood there, arms crossed, and watched. He caught the eye of a few protesters he recognized. People he'd seen at pure-blood social events, at Quidditch matches. People who'd smiled to his face because he was a Weasley, because his family was old and respected. Their eyes slid away from his, unable to hold his gaze. When Hermione emerged from a meeting and had to walk through the crowd to get to the flues, Ron was there. He positioned himself beside her, matched her calm, steady pace, and stared down anyone who got too close. Someone shouted something crude, and Ron's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He just kept walking, kept being present, kept making it clear that Hermione didn't stand alone. But the toll of it all was mounting. The Weasley family gathering in July was tense in ways it had never been before. Most of the family was solidly behind Hermione. Molly was fiercely defensive of her daughter-in-law, Arthur quietly proud, the siblings supportive, if sometimes uncomfortable with the attention. But Uncle Bilius's son, a cousin Ron had never been particularly close to, had apparently been attending the committee's rallies. Over dinner, emboldened by wine and the presence of family, he started in on Hermione's policies. "I'm just saying, there's a reason we've done things certain ways for centuries. Because those ways benefited purebloods, and nobody bothered to question whether they were fair." Hermione's voice was sharp, her patience worn thin. "Not everything is about blood status, Hermione." "Isn't it, though?" Ron interrupted, his voice quiet, but dangerous. "Because from where I'm sitting, that's exactly what it's about. Every single reform Hermione has proposed has been about treating all magical people fairly, regardless of their parentage. And every single person who's opposed those reforms has been someone who benefits from the old system." "Ron," his mother started, trying to head off the conflict. "No, Mum, I'm tired of being polite about this." Ron turned to his cousin. "Hermione is brilliant. She's kind. She's brave. She fought in a war to save our world, while half the people criticizing her now were hiding or worse. And if you can't see past her blood status to recognize that, then maybe you should leave." The dinner ended early, the family dispersing with uncomfortable goodbyes and promises to talk later. Ron felt guilty for ruining the evening, but Hermione squeezed his hand under the table and whispered, "Thank you for standing up for me, even to family." "Especially to family," Ron murmured back. "They should know better." The summer wore on, hot and tense. Hugo, now 5, started having nightmares. He couldn't articulate what frightened him, but Ron suspected the boy was picking up on the tension in the house, the worried conversations that stopped when he entered the room. The increased security that even a 5-year-old could sense wasn't normal. Rose, meanwhile, had become fiercely protective of her mother, in the way only a 7-year-old could be. She'd gotten into a fight at a playdate when another child repeated something their parents had said about that Granger woman. Rose had pushed the child into a mud puddle, and then lectured them about respect and fairness until the other child's parents came to collect them, horrified. Ron had tried to discipline Rose, tried to explain that violence wasn't the answer, but privately he was proud of her. She had her mother's sense of justice and, apparently, her father's temper. One evening in late August, Ron found Hermione on the balcony of their flat, staring out at the London skyline. She'd been quiet all evening, withdrawn in a way that worried him. "Talk to me," Ron said softly, joining her at the railing. Hermione was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was small. "Do you ever regret it, marrying me? Tying yourself to someone who brings all of this chaos and danger and hatred?" Ron felt his heart crack. He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Hermione, Granger, I have never, not for one single second, regretted marrying you. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. You and our children. The rest of it. The protests and the letters and the bigots. That's not on you. That's on them. That's on a world that's afraid of change, afraid of someone who threatens their comfortable prejudices. But the children have a mother who's teaching them to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. A mother who's showing them that you don't back down from bullies, that you keep fighting for what you believe in. Do you know what Rose said to me yesterday? She said, "When I grow up, I want to help people like Mummy does." That's your legacy, Hermione. That's what our children are learning from you. Hermione leaned into him, and Ron held her while she cried. Not the angry, frustrated tears he'd seen before, but deep, exhausted tears that spoke to how heavy the burden had become. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she whispered. "Every day is a battle. Every reform is a fight. And now they're going after our family, our children. Maybe I should step back, find a quieter role." "Hey." Ron tilted her face up to his. "You don't have to do anything. If you want to step back, we'll make it work. If you want to keep fighting, I'll be right beside you. But don't make the decision because you're scared or tired or because someone sent a threatening letter. Make it because it's what you really want." "What I want," Hermione said slowly, "is to finish what I started. I want to leave the ministry better than I found it. I want Rose and Hugo to grow up in a world where blood status doesn't matter, where all magical beings are treated with dignity. But I'm so tired, Ron. I'm so tired of fighting." "Then rest," Ron said simply. "Take a few days off. Let the ministry survive without you for a bit. Spend time with the kids. Remember why you're doing all of this." They did take time off, a long weekend at the Burrow, where Molly fussed over all of them, and Arthur kept Hugo entertained with Muggle contraptions, and the garden was full of the chaos of Weasley children. For 3 days, they didn't talk about politics or protests or threats. They just were. A family, together, safe. But on the last evening, as Ron and Hermione sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, she turned to him with something new in her eyes. Not fear or exhaustion, but determination. "I'm not giving up," she said quietly. "They can protest, they can send their letters, they can fight me at every turn, but I'm not backing down. These reforms matter too much." "Then we keep fighting," Ron said, taking her hand. "Together." What neither of them knew, dear listener, as the sun set on that peaceful evening and the first stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, was that the greatest fight was still to come. Hermione's name was being whispered in ministry corridors, not with derision now, but with speculation. The current Minister for Magic was old, tired, ready to retire. And there was talk, quiet, careful talk, of who might replace him. The Muggle-born girl from the Muggle world, the war hero, the brilliant reformer, the witch who'd never been afraid to stand up to anyone, from Death Eaters to ministry bureaucrats. Minister for Magic. And Ron, sitting beside his wife in the gathering dark, felt a chill of premonition, a sense that everything they'd faced so far had been preparation for something larger, something that would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But that, as the stars wheel slowly overhead and peace settles like a gentle blanket over the sleeping world, is a story for another chapter. For now, let us rest here, in this moment of calm before the storm, where love and determination are enough to face whatever comes. The conversation happened on a Tuesday evening in October, in the minister's private office, where Hermione had been. Called for what she'd assumed was a routine briefing. Kingsley Shacklebolt, who'd held the position of Minister for Magic since the end of the war, sat across from her with an expression that was equal parts weary and hopeful. Ron knew something significant had happened the moment Hermione came through the flue that night. She moved like someone in a dream, her eyes distant, her usual purposeful stride replaced by something slower, more contemplative. She barely noticed Rose showing her a drawing, or Hugo demanding attention for his new toy broomstick. "Can we talk?" she asked Ron quietly, once the children were finally settled in bed after 3 stories and 2 glasses of water, and one urgent trip to the bathroom that Ron suspected was more stalling tactic than genuine need. They sat in their small study, the room that had become their refuge for difficult conversations. Hermione held a glass of wine she wasn't drinking, turning it in her hands, watching the light refract through the deep red liquid. "Kingsley is retiring," she said finally. "At the end of the year. He's 68, and he says he's tired, wants to spend more time with his family, travel a bit, rest, and he wants me to run for minister." Ron felt the words hit him like a physical blow. Not surprise, exactly. He'd sensed this coming, seen the way people looked at Hermione in ministry corridors, heard the speculation in whispered conversations. But hearing it stated so plainly made it real, in a way nothing else had. "What did you tell him?" Ron asked carefully. "That I needed to think about it. That I needed to talk to you." Hermione set down her wineglass and finally looked at him. "Ron, if I do this, if I run and somehow win, everything changes. Everything. The scrutiny we've faced so far would be nothing compared to this. The threats, the protests, the hatred, it would all intensify. And it wouldn't just be me anymore. You'd be the minister's husband. Rose and Hugo would be the minister's children. Our entire lives would become public property." Ron was quiet for a long moment, thinking. He thought about the last few years, the difficulties, yes, but also the profound satisfaction of watching Hermione make real, lasting change in their world. He thought about Rose's declaration that she wanted to help people like her mother did. He thought about what it would mean for magical children everywhere to see a Muggle-born witch leading their government, proving that blood status meant nothing compared to character and competence. "Do you want to do it?" he asked. "I don't know." Hermione's voice was raw with uncertainty. "Part of me is terrified. Part of me thinks I'm not ready, that there are people far more qualified. But another part—" She paused, searching for words. "Another part thinks about all the things I could do as minister, all the reforms I've had to compromise on or scale back because I didn't have the ultimate authority. As minister, I could actually finish what I started. I could make the wizarding world the place it should be. Fair, just, inclusive." "Then I think you have your answer," Ron said gently. "But what about you? What about the children? I can't make this decision alone, Ron. It affects all of us." Ron reached across and took her hands. "Hermione, I meant what I said at the Burrow. If you want to do this, I'll be right beside you. Will it be hard? Yes. Will people say terrible things? Absolutely. But will you have my support, my love, my complete and utter faith that you're the right person for this job? Always. Even if it means your life gets turned upside down, even if it means you become known primarily as the minister's husband?" Ron felt the old insecurity flare, the fear of being defined by his relationship to someone else, of losing his own identity. But he pushed it down, recognizing it for what it was, ego, pride, the childish need to be the most important person in the room. What mattered more than his ego? His wife's ability to change the world for the better, their children growing up in that better world. Even then, he said firmly, Hermione, I've spent years figuring out who I am. I know I'm not Harry, I'm not my brothers, I'm not trying to be anyone but myself. I'm a father, a brother, a friend, a business partner to George. I make people laugh, I help at the shop, I do ministry outreach programs. That doesn't change because you become minister. The only thing that changes is that more people will know about us. But we'll still be us. Hermione's eyes filled with tears. I love you so much. I love you too. So are you going to do it? Are you going to run? She took a deep breath, and Ron saw the moment the decision crystallized, saw determination replace uncertainty. Yes, I'm going to run. The announcement came 2 weeks later, at a carefully orchestrated press conference in the ministry atrium. Hermione stood at a podium, her hair tamed into professional waves, wearing robes of deep blue that somehow managed to be both authoritative and approachable. Ron stood to the side with Kingsley and several other ministry officials, trying not to fidget under the glare of dozens of cameras and the scrutiny of every major wizarding newspaper. I stand before you today, Hermione began, her voice clear and strong, not as someone who believes they have all the answers, but as someone who believes in the fundamental principle that our magical society should serve all its members equally, regardless of their blood status, species, or origin. I'm running for Minister for Magic because I believe we can be better than we are. Because I believe that the prejudices and inequalities that have plagued our world for too long can be overcome. And because I believe that leadership isn't about maintaining the status quo, it's about having the courage to change what needs changing. Ron watched the crowd as she spoke, saw some faces light up with hope and enthusiasm, saw others darken with anger or skepticism. The divide was clear, stark, impossible to ignore. This wasn't going to be a simple campaign. This was going to be a battle for the soul of the wizarding world. The Daily Prophet's headline the next morning was predictable. Muggle-born Granger seeks highest office, qualified or audacious. The article that followed was a masterclass in coded language, questioning Hermione's limited understanding of traditional wizarding values and her controversial reform agenda. But other publications were more supportive. The Quibbler, now under Luna's editorial guidance, ran a glowing profile titled "The Minister We Need." Smaller publications, catering to Muggle-borns and progressive purebloods, endorsed her immediately. The campaign itself was grueling. Hermione was everywhere, giving speeches in the ministry atrium, visiting magical communities across Britain, attending debates with her opponent, a traditional pureblood wizard named Cornelius Blackwood, who promised to restore stability and respect tradition. Every day brought new scrutiny, new attacks, new challenges. Ron tried to maintain normalcy for the children. He kept them on their usual schedule: school, playdates, visits to the burrow. But it was impossible to completely shield them from what was happening. Rose, now 8, was old enough to understand that something important was happening, even if she didn't grasp all the implications. Hugo, at 6, just knew that Mummy was busier than usual, and that strange people with cameras sometimes followed them. The attacks on Hermione's blood status became more vicious as the campaign intensified. someone produced a pamphlet titled Muggle-borns in Government, a Historical Perspective, that was distributed throughout Wizarding Britain, filled with cherry-picked examples and thinly veiled arguments about natural magical leadership. Ron found one at the shop and had to resist the urge to track down whoever was distributing them and hex them into next week. Instead, he wrote a response, a simple, heartfelt letter to the Daily Prophet about his wife, about her qualifications, about the changes she'd already made. The Prophet didn't publish it, but the Quibbler did, and it was reprinted in several smaller publications. Ron wasn't a writer like Hermione, but his words were honest and direct, and they seemed to resonate with ordinary witches and wizards who were tired of the political games. The public appearances were the hardest part for Ron. He was expected to attend most of Hermione's major events, to stand beside her looking supportive, but not too prominent, engaged, but not attention-seeking. He had to watch his wife be attacked, questioned, doubted, and not react. Had to maintain a calm, pleasant expression while people who'd never accomplished a fraction of what Hermione had questioned her competence. At a debate in late November, Blackwood made a particularly ugly insinuation about Hermione's loyalties, suggesting that her Muggle parentage meant she couldn't truly understand or protect magical interests. Ron's hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight, with suppressed fury. But Hermione handled it perfectly, calmly dismantling Blackwood's argument with facts and logic, pointing out that she'd fought in a war to defend the magical world, while Blackwood had been safely abroad on business. Afterward, in the privacy of their home, Hermione collapsed onto the sofa and cried with exhaustion and frustration. Ron held her, stroked her hair, and said all the inadequate things people say when someone they love is hurting. But what helped most, he found, was just being there. Solid, steady, a safe place to fall apart where she didn't have to be strong or perfect or anything but herself. The threats escalated during the campaign. The anonymous letters became more specific, more violent in their language. Security around the family intensified. Auras in civilian clothes, shadowing them everywhere. Wards so complex that Ron had to learn a new password every 3 days just to enter his own home. The worst moment came in early December. Ron was at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, helping George with the holiday rush, when Harry burst through the flue, his aura robes dishevelled, his face grim. "Ron, you need to come with me, now." "What's wrong? Is it Hermione? The kids?" "Everyone's fine, but we intercepted a credible threat against Hermione. We've moved her to a safe location, and we're taking you there now. The children are with your parents." The safe house was a nondescript building in a Muggle neighborhood, protected by every defensive charm the Aura Department could muster. Hermione was there with Kingsley and the head of magical law enforcement, reviewing what Ron would later learn was a detailed plan, discovered during a raid on a group of extremists, to attack Hermione at her next public appearance. The terror Ron felt in that moment was primal, absolute. Not fear for himself, but for Hermione, for the children, for the life they'd built. He wanted to demand she withdraw from the campaign, wrap her and their children in protective spells, and hide them somewhere safe where no one could ever hurt them. But instead, he listened as Hermione calmly discussed increased security measures as she made it clear she wasn't withdrawing or hiding. And when everyone else had left and they were alone in the safe house's small bedroom, Ron finally let his composure crack. "They tried to kill you," he said, his voice shaking. "They had a plan, Hermione. They were going to actually try to kill you." "I know." Her voice was steadier than his. "But they failed. Harry and the Aurors stopped them, and I'm not going to let them scare me into giving up." "What if next time they succeed? What if the Aurors aren't fast enough, or the wards aren't strong enough? What about Rose and Hugo? What do I tell them if—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Hermione took his face in her hands, made him look at her. "Ron Weasley, you listen to me. Nothing is going to happen. I have the best protection the magical world can provide. I have Harry and the entire Aura department watching my back, and I have you, my unshakable, fierce, wonderful husband, who's already proven he'd face down anything to protect me. We're going to be fine." "You can't promise that." "No," she admitted, "I can't. But I can promise that if we give up now, if we let fear win, then they've already succeeded. They've already defeated us. And I refuse to be defeated. Not by prejudice, not by hatred, not by fear." Ron pulled her close, buried his face in her hair, and held her like she was the only solid thing in a tilting world. He understood, intellectually, why she had to keep going. He admired her courage, her conviction, her refusal to back down. But understanding didn't make it easier. Love, he was learning, was sometimes about supporting someone's dangerous decisions because those decisions were true to who they were. The campaign entered its final month with an intensity that bordered on madness. Hermione was exhausted, running on determination and too much coffee. Ron had essentially moved into a support role. He'd taken a leave of absence from the shop so he could manage the household, care for the children, and be available whenever Hermione needed him. George understood, of course. "Go help your wife become minister," he'd said, clapping Ron on the shoulder. "The shop will still be here when this is over." Ron took on part-time roles with Hermione's campaign. Nothing public, just behind-the-scenes work coordinating with local wizarding communities, reaching out to working-class witches and wizards who might be skeptical of a ministry official, but would listen to Ron Weasley, who worked in a joke shop and spoke their language. The final debate, held in the ministry atrium before an audience of hundreds and broadcast throughout Wizarding Britain, was Hermione's finest moment. Blackwood went on the attack, questioning everything from her experience to her judgment to her radical agenda. And Hermione calmly, methodically, brilliantly destroyed every argument. But it was the end of the debate that people would remember. Blackwood, growing desperate, made one final attack. The question before us is simple. Do we want a minister who understands our traditions, our heritage, our way of life? Or do we want to hand our government to someone whose parents couldn't even perform a levitation charm? The audience gasped. It was the most direct reference to Hermione's Muggle parentage anyone had made publicly during the campaign. Ron felt fury surge through him, started to stand, to protest. But Hermione held up a hand, her expression serene. "My opponent is right about one thing," she said quietly, and the entire atrium went silent. "My parents couldn't perform a levitation charm. They were Muggle. Dentists. Good people who taught their daughter the value of hard work, education, and treating everyone with dignity. What they could do was raise a child who would go on to fight in a war to defend a magical world that didn't always welcome her. Who would dedicate her career to making that world more just, more fair, more worthy of the magic we've been given. My blood status isn't a weakness, it's a perspective. It means I understand that magic is a gift, not a birthright. That it should be used to build bridges, not walls. And yes, I'm proud of my Muggle heritage. I'm proud of my parents. And I hope that if the wizarding world chooses me as minister, they'll be choosing someone who believes that what matters isn't where we come from, but what we choose to do with the magic we're given. The applause started slowly, then built, filling the atrium until it echoed off the marble floors and gilded ceiling. Ron, watching from the audience, felt tears streaming down his face. That was his wife. That brilliant, brave, extraordinary woman was his wife. The election was held on a cold December day. The results wouldn't be announced until midnight, after all the votes had been counted and verified. Ron and Hermione spent the evening at home with the children, trying to maintain normalcy, even as owls arrived every few minutes with updates from campaign volunteers. Rose and Hugo were finally in bed when Harry and Ginny arrived via Floo, followed shortly by various Weasley family members, until their small flat was packed with people Ron loved, all of them waiting, hoping, fearing. Midnight arrived. The official announcement came via Ministry Owl. The results projected into the air above the letter in glowing numbers. Hermione Granger Weasley, 52%. Cornelius Blackwood, 48%. She'd won. By a narrow margin, but she'd won. The Muggle-born witch, the war hero, the reformer, she was going to be Minister for Magic. The room erupted in celebration, cheering, crying, hugging. Molly was sobbing openly, Arthur beaming with pride. George lifted Ron off his feet in a bear hug. Harry just stood there grinning like he'd won something himself. But Ron found himself looking at Hermione, who stood very still in the centre of the chaos. Her face a complex mix of joy and terror and overwhelming responsibility. He made his way through the crowd to her side, took her hand. "You did it," he said quietly, just for her. "We did it," she corrected, squeezing his hand. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Ron. You know that, right?" "I know you could have," Ron said honestly. "You're extraordinary. But I'm glad I got to be here for it anyway." They had 15 minutes of celebration before the first crisis of Hermione's administration arrived. An urgent owl from the ministry about matters that needed immediate attention, decisions that couldn't wait even one more day. Hermione read it, her expression shifting from celebration to focus in an instant. And Ron saw his future written clearly in that moment. This was what their life would be now. Constant demands, endless responsibilities, the weight of the magical world on Hermione's shoulders. And Ron's job, his role, his purpose, to stand beside her through all of it, to be the steady ground when everything else was shifting, to remind her, when she forgot, that she was still Hermione, still the woman he'd fallen in love with, not just Minister for Magic, but a wife, a mother, a person who deserved moments of peace and joy and ordinary life. It wouldn't be easy. The hardest part, Ron suspected, was yet to come. But standing there in their crowded flat, watching his wife prepare to shoulder an impossible burden, Ron felt a clarity he'd never experienced before. His strength wasn't in being the hero of his own story. It was in being the unshakable support that allowed Hermione to be the hero of hers. The minister's residence was nothing like their cosy flat in London. It was a sprawling estate, hidden somewhere in the Scottish countryside, protected by ancient wards and modern security charms, layered so thickly that Ron could feel them humming in his bones. The house itself was beautiful. all stone and wood, and enchanted windows that showed different views depending on the time of day, but it felt more like a museum than a home. "We don't have to live here," Hermione had said on their first tour of the residence, watching Rose and Hugo run through rooms that echoed with their footsteps. "Previous ministers have maintained their own homes. This is more for official functions, hosting foreign dignitaries, that sort of thing." But Ron had seen the security reports, had listened to the auras explain that protecting the family in their London flat would require a level of disruption to the neighbourhood that wasn't fair to their Muggle neighbours. The minister's residence, for all its grandeur and strangeness, was designed for security. It was the safest place for their family. "We'll make it home," Ron had said, squeezing Hermione's hand. "It's just walls and floors. We'll fill it with our chaos, and it'll be home soon enough." Moving in happened during the first week of January, in a flurry of packing and unpacking, and ministry officials arriving with urgent documents for Hermione to review. Rose cried because she had to leave her bedroom in the flat, the one with the unicorn wallpaper she'd picked out herself. Hugo was fascinated by the moving portraits until he got lost in a corridor that apparently only appeared on Tuesdays and had to be found by a harried house elf. The house elves were another adjustment. 3 of them came with the residents, Pipsy, Dobbin, and Tilly, and they were horrified by Hermione's initial attempts to do her own cooking and cleaning. "Minister must not scrub floors," Pipsy had wailed, literally wringing her tiny hands. "Pipsy's job. Minister has important work." It had taken several careful conversations, and a written agreement outlining fair working conditions, time off, and wages that the elves initially refused, but eventually accepted, before an uneasy peace was established. The elves would help with the household, but Hermione would still cook breakfast every Saturday, because it was her favourite part of the week, and the children would still be expected to clean their own rooms, because that was about learning responsibility, not about forcing house elves to do everything. The first month was chaos. Hermione was at the ministry by 6 in the morning most days, often not returning until well after the children's bedtime. She was implementing her agenda with characteristic determination, restructuring departments, appointing new division heads, pushing through reforms that had languished for years. It was exhilarating and exhausting, and she came home most nights too tired to do anything but review more paperwork before collapsing into bed. Ron, meanwhile, was learning to navigate his new role. He'd officially taken an extended leave from Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, though he still consulted with George regularly. His days were filled with school runs, helping Hugo with his early reading lessons, attending Rose's school events, managing a household that seemed to require constant attention. But he was also the minister's husband, which came with its own set of expectations. There were official functions to attend, visiting dignitaries to entertain, social obligations that couldn't be avoided. Ron had to learn proper formal etiquette, had to get fitted for more dress robes than he'd owned in his entire life, had to master the art of making polite conversation with people he often didn't like very much. The hardest part was the loss of privacy. There were always auras around, discreet, professional, but always there. Ron couldn't take the children to Diagon Alley without security protocols, couldn't visit the Burrow without advance notice so protective wards could be adjusted, couldn't do anything spontaneous without considering security implications. And then there was the public scrutiny. Everything was analysed, criticised, discussed, what Hermione wore to official functions, how Ron stood beside her at events, whether they were too affectionate in public or not affectionate enough. Parenting decisions that should have been private became fodder for Daily Prophet opinion pieces. The first major crisis of Hermione's administration came in February, barely a month after she'd taken office. A proposed reform to the Department of International Magical Cooperation, one that would establish formal diplomatic relations with Muggle governments, had sparked fierce opposition from traditionalists. The vote was close, the debate vicious. Hermione worked around the clock leading up to the vote, building coalitions, negotiating compromises, calling in favours. Ron barely saw her for 3 days. When he did see her, she was pale and exhausted, surviving on pepper-up, potions and sheer willpower. The night before the vote, Ron found her in her study at 2 a.m, surrounded by papers, her eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion. "Come to bed," he said gently. "I can't. I need to review the final draft, make sure there are no loopholes they can exploit." "Hermione, you've done everything you can. The proposal is solid. If they vote it down, it won't be, because you didn't work hard enough. But if I just review it one more time..." Ron crossed the room, gently but firmly closed the folder she was reading, and pulled her to her feet. "Bed. Now. You'll be sharper tomorrow if you actually sleep." She was too tired to argue. Ron guided her to their bedroom, helped her out of her robes, and held her as she finally let herself rest. She was asleep in minutes, her breathing evening out, her body relaxing against his. Ron lay awake longer, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of worry that had become his constant companion. This was their life now. Hermione pushing herself to the breaking point, Ron trying to hold everything else together, both of them hoping it would be enough. The vote passed, barely. By a margin of 3 votes, Hermione's reform was approved. The victory should have been sweet, but Hermione came home that night looking more defeated than triumphant. 3 votes, she said quietly. Out of hundreds of ministry officials, 3 votes made the difference. 3 people who might change their minds tomorrow, who might be influenced by the next smear campaign or the next protest. But they didn't change their minds today, Ron pointed out. Today, you won. Today you moved the wizarding world a little bit closer to where it needs to be. At what cost? Hermione's voice cracked. "Ron, I missed Hugo's school play last week. I forgot Rose's parent-teacher conference. I can barely remember the last time we had a family dinner where I wasn't distracted by work. What kind of mother does that make me?" Ron pulled her into his arms. "The kind who's teaching her children that important work sometimes requires sacrifice. The kind who's showing them that you don't give up just because something is hard. Rose understands, Hermione. Hugo understands. They're proud of you. Are they? Or do they just miss their mother?" It was a question Ron couldn't fully answer, because there was truth in both possibilities. The children were proud. Rose had written an essay at school about her mother being Minister for Magic, had defended Hermione against classmates who repeated their parents' criticisms. But they also missed her. Hugo had started having nightmares again, and Rose had become clingy in a way that wasn't typical for her. The solution, when it came, was imperfect, but necessary. Ron and Hermione established boundaries, hard boundaries that would be protected as fiercely as any security ward. Saturday mornings were family time, no exceptions. No ministry business, no official functions, just the four of them having breakfast together and doing something fun. Ron insisted on it, and to Hermione's credit, she honoured it. Those Saturday mornings became sacred. They'd fly together in the gardens. The grounds were large enough for proper Quidditch, and Hugo was finally old enough to stay on a toy broom without constant supervision. They'd cook elaborate breakfasts where everyone participated, even if Hugo's help usually meant more mess than actual assistance. They'd read together, play games, tell stories, simply be a family without the weight of office pressing down on them. But 6 days a week, the weight was still there. Ron found himself becoming the primary parent in ways he hadn't anticipated. He was the one who helped with homework, who attended school events, who kissed scraped knees and mediated sibling arguments. He loved it, loved being so central to his children's lives, but he also felt the strain of being always on, always responsible, always the one who had to hold things together. The breaking point came in March, on Hugo's 7th birthday. Hermione had promised, absolutely promised, that she'd be home by noon for the party. Just family. Nothing elaborate, but Hugo had been talking about it for weeks. He wanted his mum to help him blow out the candles on his cake. Noon came and went. 1 o'clock. 2 o'clock. Hugo's face grew progressively sadder, his eyes welling with tears he refused to shed. Rose tried to distract him, and Ron felt his heart breaking as he watched his 6-year-old daughter try to comfort her younger brother because their mother was late again. At 3:30, Hermione burst through the flue, breathless and apologetic. An emergency session of the Wizengamot, a crisis she couldn't have anticipated. So sorry. She'd make it up to Hugo. Ron looked at his son's tear-stained face, at Rose's carefully neutral expression, and felt something snap inside him. "Can I speak to you?" he said to Hermione, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Privately?" They went to their bedroom, and Ron let loose every bit of frustration and anger he'd been holding back for months. "You promised him, Hermione. You looked our son in the eyes and promised you'd be here, and he believed you because you're his mother, and children trust their parents. And then you weren't here. Again. I know, and I'm sorry, but the Wizengamot, there's always going to be something." Ron's voice rose despite his efforts to keep it level. "There's always going to be one more emergency, one more crisis, one more thing that absolutely can't wait. But our children can't wait either. They're growing up, Hermione. Every day we miss is a day we don't get back." "I'm doing the best I can." Hermione's own anger flared. "I'm trying to run an entire government while being a mother and a wife, and nothing I do is ever enough. I'm not enough for the ministry. I'm not enough for you. I'm not enough for the children." "That's not what I'm saying." Ron ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "You are enough. More than enough. But something has to give, Hermione. You can't keep working 18-hour days and expecting to have anything left for your family. So what are you suggesting? That I resign? That I give up everything I've worked for?" "No, I'm suggesting that you delegate more, that you trust your department heads to handle some things without your direct involvement, that you accept that you don't have to personally oversee every single aspect of the ministry. If I don't oversee it, if I don't make sure it's done right, then the reforms fail. People's lives are at stake, Ron. Real people who are depending on me to... And what about the real people who live in this house? Your children who are depending on you to show up when you promise? Your husband who's holding everything together but is getting bloody exhausted trying to do it alone. The fight went on for another hour, both of them saying things they partially meant and partially didn't. Both of them hurt and angry and scared. It ended with Hermione crying in Ron's arms, both of them apologizing, both of them acknowledging that something had to change, but neither quite sure how to make it happen. The compromise they reached was imperfect. Hermione would make a genuine effort to leave work at a reasonable hour at least 3 days a week. She would block out time on her calendar for important family events and treat those blocks as seriously as meetings with foreign dignitaries. She would delegate more to her senior staff, even when it made her anxious to relinquish control. And Ron would try to be more understanding when emergencies did arise, would trust that Hermione was doing her best, would stop keeping score of every missed dinner and every broken promise. It helped. Not perfectly, and there were still bad days, but it helped. Hermione started coming home for dinner on Tuesdays and Thursdays without fail. She made Rose's next parent-teacher conference and was there when Hugo performed in his school's end-of-year production, even if she had to leave immediately after to handle a crisis with the Department of Mysteries. Ron, meanwhile, found ways to carve out his own identity beyond the minister's husband. He started consulting with the Department of Magical Games and Sports on community Quidditch programs, using his experience as both a player and a spectator to develop initiatives that brought magic and sport to underprivileged communities. It was part-time work, flexible enough to accommodate his family responsibilities, but meaningful enough to make him feel like he was contributing something of his own. George, bless him, remained endlessly understanding. "The shop's doin' fine," he'd say, whenever Ron expressed guilt about being away so long. "Business is boomin', actually. People like buying jokes from the brother of the Minister for Magic. Makes them feel like they're getting something. Authentic. You take care of your family, Ron. That's the most important thing you can do right now." The summer brought new challenges. There were threats. Always threats. But one in particular was credible enough that security was increased even further. An extremist group calling themselves the Purebloods Alliance had been making increasingly violent statements about Hermione's government. When Aurors raided their headquarters, they found detailed plans, including surveillance photos of Rose and Hugo. Ron's terror was visceral, primal. Someone had been watching his children, photographing them, planning who knew what. He wanted to rage, to hunt down every member of the Alliance personally and make them regret ever looking at his family. Instead, he held it together. He sat down with Rose, who was 9 now, and old enough to understand at least some of what was happening, and explained that there were people who didn't like the changes Mum was making, and that meant they all had to be extra careful for a while. "Are we in danger?" Rose asked, her voice small but steady. Ron considered lying, considered reassuring her that everything was fine, but Rose deserved the truth, or at least a version of it she could handle. "The Aurors are doing everything they can to keep us safe," he said carefully. "And your mum and I won't let anything happen to you or Hugo. But yes, we need to be careful. We need to follow the security rules, even when they seem annoying or inconvenient." "I don't want Mum to stop being minister," Rose said fiercely. "She's good at it. She's making things better." Ron pulled his daughter into a hug, overwhelmed by her bravery and her certainty. "She is making things better. And we're going to keep supporting her, okay? No matter what. Hugo, thankfully, was young enough that the increased security just seemed like an adventure. He made friends with one of the Aurors, a kind witch named Simmons, who showed him basic defensive wand movements and let him pretend to help with security checks. The crisis passed. The Alliance members were arrested, their threat neutralized. But it left scars. Left Ron more aware than ever of how fragile their safety was, how much they'd sacrificed for Hermione's ability to lead. In quieter moments, usually late at night when the children were asleep and Hermione was working in her study, Ron would sit on the terrace of the minister's residence and look out at the Scottish countryside. He'd think about the life he'd imagined as a young man, simple, uncomplicated, far from the spotlight. This wasn't that life. This was harder, more complex, more demanding than anything he'd anticipated. There were days when he felt like he was drowning in responsibility, days when he missed the simplicity of working at the shop with George, days when he wondered if he was strong enough to keep doing this. But then Hermione would finish her work and come find him on the terrace. She'd sit beside him, her head on his shoulder, and they'd just be quiet together. And Ron would remember why he was doing this. Not for glory or recognition, not even for the satisfaction of supporting important work, but simply because this brilliant, difficult, extraordinary woman was his wife, and he'd promised to stand beside her through everything. "Thank you," Hermione said one night, breaking the comfortable silence. "For what?" "For being my foundation, for keeping our family together while I try to keep the ministry together, for not resenting me, even when you'd have every right to." "I do resent you sometimes," Ron said honestly. "When you miss another dinner, or when I'm the one dealing with Hugo's tantrum because you're not here. But it passes, because I know what you're doing matters, and I know you're doing your best." "I love you so much," Hermione whispered. "I couldn't do any of this without you." "I know," Ron said, a smile in his voice. "But the thing is, Hermione, I'm not doing this so you can do your job. I'm doing it because we're a team. Because this is our life, not just yours. The good parts and the hard parts, we share them. It wasn't a perfect life. It was messy and complicated and often overwhelming. But it was theirs, built on a foundation of love and trust that had been tested by war, and now by peace, by obscurity, and now by fame, and had remained unshaken through it all. Little did Ron know, dear listener, as the stars wheeled overhead and another crisis loomed on the horizon, that his strength was about to be tested in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The hardest moments, the defining moments, were still ahead. But that is a story for the next chapter. For now, let us rest here, in this moment of hard-won peace, where love proves stronger than any obstacle. The spring of Hermione's third year as Minister for Magic arrived with unseasonable warmth and a political climate that was anything but gentle. The Magical Integration Act, Hermione's most ambitious reform, yet was scheduled for its final vote in the Wizengamot. If passed, it would fundamentally reshape the relationship between the magical and Muggle worlds, establishing formal cooperation on matters of mutual concern, creating exchange programs, and dismantling centuries of enforced separation. It was revolutionary. It was necessary. And it had divided the wizarding world more sharply than anything since Voldemort's fall. Ron watched Hermione prepare for the vote with a mixture of pride and dread. She'd been working toward this moment for 3 years, building coalitions, negotiating compromises, making promises, and calling in favours. The vote would be close, desperately, terrifyingly close. Every projection showed the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. The threats had intensified as the vote approached. Not just anonymous letters anymore, but organised protests outside the ministry, demonstrations in Diagon Alley, even a few incidents of violence, property damage, hexes thrown at ministry officials. One particularly ugly confrontation that had sent 2 junior assistants to St. Mungo's. The Aura department had tripled security around Hermione. Harry himself had taken to personally overseeing her protection detail, his face grim with the same determination Ron remembered from the war. But even Harry's best efforts couldn't protect against everything. The morning of the vote, Ron woke to find Hermione already dressed, standing at the window of their bedroom, staring out at the dawn breaking over the Scottish hills. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "I keep running through the numbers," she said quietly, "counting and recounting. We should have enough votes, but it's so close, Ron. One person changes their mind, one person doesn't show up, and it fails. 3 years of work, all the political capital I've spent, everything I've sacrificed, it could all fail today." Ron got out of bed, crossed to her, wrapped his arms around her from behind. "And if it does fail?" "Then I try again. Revise the proposal, rebuild the coalition, fight another day." Her voice was steady, but Ron could feel her trembling slightly. "But I'm so tired, Ron. I'm so tired of fighting for every inch of progress, of watching people I thought were allies turn away because they're afraid of change, of defending basic decency as if it's some radical position." "I know." Ron rested his chin on top of her head. "But you're not alone in this fight. You've never been alone." Hermione turned in his arms, looked up at him with eyes that held both exhaustion and determination. "Promise me something. Anything. If something happens to me, don't." Ron's voice was sharp. "Don't start talking like that. Ron, please, just listen. If something happens to me, I need you to promise that you'll tell Rose and Hugo why I did this. Tell them it mattered. Tell them their mother believed in something bigger than herself, and that making the world better was worth the cost." Ron felt his throat tighten. "Nothing is going to happen to you. Harry has the best auras in Britain watching you. The ministry is locked down tighter than Gringotts. You're going to walk into that chamber, you're going to give the speech of your life, and you're going to watch this vote pass." "You can't know that." "I know you," Ron said fiercely. "I know that you've faced down worse than a difficult vote. You've faced Death Eaters and dark magic and a war that should have killed us all. A room full of politicians doesn't scare Hermione Granger." A small smile touched her lips. Hermione Granger Weasley. "Damn right." Ron kissed her forehead. "Now come eat breakfast with your family. Rose and Hugo deserve to see you before you go make history." Breakfast was a study in contrasts. Rose, now 11 and about to start Hogwarts in the fall, understood the weight of the day. She was quiet, watching her mother with solemn eyes, as if trying to memorize every detail. Hugo, 9 and still more interested in Quidditch than politics, chattered about the upcoming match between the Chudley Cannons and the Holyhead Harpies, blissfully unaware of the tension crackling through the air. Hermione listened to Hugo with genuine attention, asked questions about his favourite players, laughed at his enthusiastic predictions. Ron loved her fiercely in that moment, for being able to set aside the enormous weight of the day to focus on their son's simple joy. When it was time to leave, Rose hugged Hermione tightly. "Good luck, Mum," she whispered. "I know you'll do brilliantly." "Thank you, sweetheart." Hermione held her daughter close. "I love you so much." Hugo's hug was briefer, but no less sincere. "Can we go flying when you get home?" "Absolutely," Hermione promised. "Win or lose, we'll go flying." Ron walked Hermione to the flue, the auras discreetly giving them a moment of privacy. He pulled her close, kissed her deeply, tried to pour every ounce of love and faith and support he had into that kiss. "I'll be watching," he said. "The whole speech will be broadcast. I'll be right there with you." "I know." Hermione's hand lingered on his cheek. "My unshakable foundation." And then she was gone, in a swirl of green flames, leaving Ron standing in the empty room with his heart pounding, and a sense of foreboding he couldn't quite shake. The vote was scheduled for 2 o'clock. Ron spent the morning trying to keep busy, playing with Hugo, helping Rose pack for a sleepover at the Burrow that weekend, answering correspondence that had piled up. But his mind was at the ministry, imagining Hermione preparing her speech, meeting with allies, making last-minute adjustments to the proposal. At 1:30, he settled into the study with Rose beside him. Hugo was playing in the garden under Simmons's watchful eye. Ron activated the enchanted mirror that would show the Wizengamot proceedings, and together he and Rose waited. The chamber filled. Slowly, witches and wizards in formal robes, their faces serious, the weight of history evident in their bearing. Ron recognized many of them, allies and opponents of both, people who'd supported Hermione and people who'd fought her every step of the way. At precisely 2 o'clock, Hermione entered the chamber. She wore robes of deep purple, her hair pulled back in an elegant twist, her minister's badge gleaming on her chest. She looked every inch the leader she'd become, confident, composed, utterly in control. The chief warlock called the session to order, and the debate began. Opponents spoke first, their arguments polished and persuasive. They spoke of tradition, of the statute of secrecy, of the dangers of exposing the magical world to Muggle scrutiny. Some were openly hostile, questioning Hermione's judgment and her loyalty to magical society. Others were more subtle, wrapping their opposition in concern for security and stability. Ron felt his anger rising with each speech, felt Rose tense beside him. "They're wrong," she muttered. "Don't they see how wrong they are?" "They're scared," Ron said quietly. "People say terrible things when they're scared of change." Hermione's supporters spoke next, and Ron felt a surge of pride as he heard them defend the proposal with passion and eloquence. Many cited Hermione's previous reforms, the improvements in creature rights, the dismantling of discriminatory laws, the professionalization of the Aura department. They spoke of her competence, her vision, her unwavering commitment to justice. And then it was Hermione's turn. She rose from her seat, crossed to the speaker's podium, and looked out at the assembled Wizengamot with calm certainty. "Members of the Wizengamot," she began, her voice clear and strong. "We stand today at a crossroads. We can choose to maintain the barriers that have separated magical and Muggle society for centuries, or we can choose to build bridges. We can choose fear, or we can choose hope." Ron listened, transfixed, as Hermione laid out her vision. She spoke of the wars that had scarred both worlds, of threats that respected no boundary between magic and Muggle. She spoke of the contributions Muggle-borns had made to magical society, of the innovations and insights that came from straddling both worlds. She spoke of her own parents, of growing up between two cultures and learning that both had value, both had wisdom to offer. "I'm not asking you to abandon our traditions," Hermione said, her voice passionate now. "I'm asking you to recognize that traditions can evolve, that protecting what we value doesn't mean freezing it in amber. The magical world I love, the world of wonder and beauty and power, doesn't become less magical by opening itself to cooperation and understanding. It becomes more." She spoke for 20 minutes, and Ron didn't look away once. Neither did Rose, her young face intent with concentration, absorbing every word. The speech ended with a statement that Ron knew Hermione had laboured over for weeks. "I believe in the goodness of magic. I believe in the wisdom of witches and wizards who came before us. But I also believe that we owe it to those who come after us, to our children and their children, to leave them a world that's better, fairer, more connected than the one we inherited. Vote yes, not because I'm asking you to, but because it's the right thing to do, because in your hearts you know that fear is not a foundation for the future." The chamber was silent when she finished. For a long moment no one moved, no one spoke. Then, slowly, applause began, first from her supporters, then spreading, until even some of her opponents were clapping, acknowledging if not agreeing with the power of her words. The vote was called. Each member of the Wizengamot stood, when their name was called, stated their vote clearly for the record. Ron watched the tally, his heart in his throat, Rose's hand gripping his tightly. It was close, agonizingly close. The numbers climbed slowly. Yes, no, yes, yes, no, no, yes. Ron lost count, couldn't keep track, could only watch and hope and pray to whatever magic was listening. And then, finally, the chief warlock spoke. "The vote is complete. 147 in favour, 139 opposed, 14 abstentions. The Magical Integration Act is hereby approved." Rose shrieked with joy, hugging Ron tightly. In the mirror, Ron could see the chamber erupting in chaos. Some members celebrating, others shouting in anger, most simply stunned that such a controversial measure had actually passed. But Ron's eyes were only on Hermione. She stood very still at the podium, her face showing the same complex mix of triumph and relief and exhaustion he'd seen on the night she'd won the election. She'd done it. Against all odds, despite all opposition, she'd actually done it. The celebration was short-lived. Ron was still hugging Rose, still processing the magnitude of what they'd just witnessed, when the mirror's image suddenly went dark. Not a normal end to the broadcast, an abrupt, violent cutting off of the feed. Ron's blood went cold. "Stay here," he told Rose, his voice sharp with urgency. "Don't leave this room." He ran from the study, shouting for the auras, for anyone who might know what had happened. Simmons appeared immediately, her wand already drawn, her face grim. "What's going on?" Ron demanded. "We don't know yet. We've lost contact with the ministry detail. Could be just a communication disruption, but it could be an attack." Ron felt terror clawing at his throat. "I need to go there. I need to get to Hermione." "Mr. Weasley, I can't let you—" "That's my wife," Ron's voice broke. "If something's happened to her, if she's hurt or I have to go, please." Simmons hesitated for only a moment, then nodded sharply. "I'll take you myself, but you do exactly as I say. Understood?" They flewed to the ministry's emergency entrance, a secure point Ron had never used before. The atrium was in chaos. People running, shouting, defensive spells crackling through the air. Ron could smell smoke, could hear the sounds of a battle still ongoing. "Stay behind me," Simmons ordered, and Ron obeyed, following her through corridors that seemed both familiar and utterly foreign in their current state of emergency. They found Harry first, directing auras with sharp, efficient commands. His face was bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow, his robes torn, but he was alive and functional. "Ron, you shouldn't be here." "Where is she?" Ron's voice was raw. "Harry, where's Hermione?" Harry's expression softened with understanding. "She's safe. Shaken, but safe. There was an attack. Extremists broke through the wards during the chaos after the vote. We've neutralized the threat, but it was close. Too close." Relief flooded through Ron so intensely he nearly collapsed. "I need to see her." "She's in the secure conference room. I'll take you." The walk through the ministry corridors seemed to take forever. Ron saw evidence of the attack everywhere. Scorch marks on walls, broken furniture, ministry workers being treated for injuries. His imagination supplied horrible images of what might have happened. What could have happened if the auras hadn't been prepared? Hermione was sitting in the conference room, surrounded by senior ministry officials and auras. She looked up when Ron entered, and for a moment they just stared at each other. Then Hermione stood, crossed the room in 3 steps, and threw herself into Ron's arms. He held her as she shook, as months of tension and fear and stress finally broke through her iron control. She wasn't crying. Hermione rarely cried in public, but she was trembling violently, her face pressed against his chest, her hands fisted in his robes. "I'm here," Ron murmured into her hair. "I've got you. You're safe." "They tried to kill me," Hermione whispered, so quietly only Ron could hear. During the celebration, they broke through the wards. If Harry hadn't been there, if the auras hadn't moved so quickly, Ron, they would have killed me. "But they didn't," Ron said fiercely. "They didn't, Hermione. You're here. You're alive. And the vote passed. You won." She pulled back slightly, looked up at him with eyes that held a new kind of exhaustion. Not just physical, but spiritual. The weariness of someone who'd been fighting for so long and was starting to wonder if peace would ever come. "At what cost?" she asked. "People were hurt today, Ron. Ministry workers who were just doing their jobs got caught in an attack because extremists hate what I'm trying to do. How can I call that winning? Because those extremists are a shrinking minority trying to stop progress they know is inevitable," Ron said. "Because you passed the most important reform of your administration despite their threats and their violence. Because every person who supported you, every vote you won, represents someone who believes in the future you're building. That's how you call it winning." The aftermath of the attack dominated the next several weeks. The extremists were captured and tried, members of a group that had been planning the attack for months, waiting for the moment when security would be stretched thin by the crowds after the vote. Their leader was a pure-blood wizard from an old family, someone who'd professed support for Hermione publicly while secretly funding the opposition. The betrayal stung, but it also galvanized support for Hermione's position. The attack had been meant to intimidate her into resignation or retreat. Instead, it unified her base and won her sympathy even from some previous opponents. Public opinion shifted noticeably. The image of the minister narrowly escaping an assassination attempt because she'd fought for integration and equality was powerful. Harder to argue against than any speech. But the personal cost was high. Hermione had nightmares for weeks, waking in the middle of the night, gasping and shaking. Ron would hold her, remind her she was safe, but he knew that kind of trauma didn't heal quickly. Security around the family increased even further. The children couldn't go anywhere without aura escorts now, and even the burrow had additional protective wards. Rose and Hugo handled it differently. Rose became fiercely protective of her mother, defensive against any criticism, proud to the point of combativeness. Hugo withdrew slightly, became quieter, spent more time in his room. Ron worried about both of them, spent hours talking to each child individually, trying to help them process what was happening. One evening in late spring, Ron found himself alone with George at the shop. They were doing inventory, a comfortable routine that required just enough attention to occupy the hands, but left the mind free to wander. "You doing okay?" George asked, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp. "Honestly, I don't know." Ron set down the box of pygmy puffs he'd been counting. "I keep waiting for it to get easier, you know? Keep thinking we'll settle into some kind of normal routine. But it never does. There's always another crisis, another threat, another impossible situation." "That's what you signed up for when you married her," George pointed out, not unkindly. "I know, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat. But sometimes I look at Rose and Hugo, at how much they've had to sacrifice because their mother is Minister, and I wonder if we made the right choice." "Did Hermione have a choice?" George asked. "Could she have turned down the position and still been herself?" Ron considered this. No, she couldn't have. Being Minister, fighting for what she believes in, it's not just what she does, it's who she is. Then you made the only choice you could make. Supporting her means supporting all of it, the good parts and the terrifying parts. George clapped Ron on the shoulder. "You know what Fred used to say? He said the hardest thing about being a twin wasn't sharing everything. It was knowing that if something happened to one of us, the other wouldn't be whole anymore. You and Hermione, you're not twins, but you're bonded just as deeply. Her pain is your pain. Her triumphs are your triumphs. That's what partnership means." The conversation stayed with Ron through the following weeks. He thought about it when Hermione worked late, and he had to explain to Hugo why Mummy couldn't read bedtime stories again. He thought about it when Rose came home from school, upset because classmates had made comments about the attack. He thought about it during the quiet moments when Hermione would find him and simply hold him, drawing strength from his presence. The Magical Integration Act's implementation began in early summer. It was careful, measured, building connections slowly and deliberately. But it was happening. Muggle and magical officials meeting for the first time in centuries, exchange programs being established, frameworks for cooperation being built. Ron watched Hermione throw herself into the implementation with renewed determination. The attack had shaken her, yes, but it had also clarified something. She knew now, with absolute certainty, that this work mattered enough to risk everything for. And Ron had his own clarity. His purpose wasn't diminished by supporting Hermione's work. It was defined by it. He was the foundation that allowed her to build. He was the home she returned to after battles. He was the reminder that she was loved, not for what she accomplished, but for who she was. The greatest strength Ron had finally learned wasn't in being the hero of your own story. It was in choosing to be part of someone else's story, not as a supporting character, but as an essential element, the foundation stone without which the whole structure would crumble. The years passed as years do, sometimes rushing like water over stones, sometimes crawling like honey from a jar. Hermione served 2 terms as Minister for Magic, 8 years that transformed the wizarding world in ways both dramatic and subtle. The Magical Integration Act became the foundation for a new era of cooperation. Discriminatory laws fell one by one like dominoes. The ministry itself was restructured, opened, made more transparent and accountable. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks and compromises, political battles and personal costs. But slowly, steadily, the world changed. And through it all, Ron was there, steady as bedrock, unshakable as the earth itself. Rose went to Hogwarts and was sorted into Gryffindor, to no one's surprise. She became head girl in her 7th year, following in her mother's footsteps in that, as in so many things. But she had her father in her too, his loyalty, his humour, his ability to make friends across house lines and see past surface differences. She graduated with honours and went to work in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, determined to continue her mother's work of reform. Hugo, sorted into Hufflepuff to everyone's delight, found his own path. He had his father's love of Quidditch and played keeper for his house team with dedication, if not spectacular talent. More importantly, he had Ron's gift for connection, for making people feel valued and heard. After Hogwarts, he chose not to work at the ministry at all, instead joining George at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, bringing new energy and ideas to the shop that had been such an important part of his father's journey. When Hermione decided not to seek a 3rd term, Ron was the only one who understood why before she explained it. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she'd given everything she had and needed to step back before there was nothing left to give. She was 52, still young by wizarding standards, but 8 years of carrying the weight of an entire world had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with wrinkles or grey hair. "I've done what I set out to do," she told Ron one evening as they sat together in the garden of the minister's residence. "The Integration Act is established, the reforms are in place, the structures are built. It's time for someone else to build on that foundation, time for me to remember who I am when I'm not Minister for Magic." "And who is that?" Ron asked gently. Hermione smiled, took his hand. "I'm still figuring that out, but I know I'm ready to try." They moved back to a house in the countryside, not the Burrow, but close enough that they could visit easily. It was smaller than the minister's residence, but felt more like home from the moment they arrived. Hermione took a position teaching at Hogwarts, becoming the Muggle Studies professor and revolutionizing the curriculum to reflect actual Muggle society rather than the quaint, outdated view that had persisted for decades. Ron finally returned full-time to Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. He and George and Hugo worked together. 3 generations of Weasley humour and ingenuity, creating products that brought joy to wizarding children across Britain. The shop thrived, expanded, became an institution. Not just a place to buy jokes, but a reminder that laughter and lightness mattered just as much as serious magic. The grandchildren came. Rose's twins first, a boy and a girl with her fierce intelligence and their father's gentle nature. Then Hugo's daughter, born with red hair and a mischievous grin that reminded everyone of Fred. Ron discovered that being a grandfather was different from being a father. Lighter somehow, full of joy, without quite as much responsibility. He could spoil them and play with them, and then send them home when they got cranky. The wizarding world continued to change, building on Hermione's foundation. The next minister was a half-blood witch who'd worked in Hermione's administration, and she continued many of the same policies. Integration deepened. Cooperation expanded. The old barriers didn't disappear entirely. Centuries of separation couldn't be undone in a single generation, but they were weakening, becoming permeable. Ron and Hermione found a rhythm to their life that had eluded them during the intense years of her ministry. They had breakfast together every morning without fail. They took long walks through the countryside, talking about everything and nothing. They visited the burrow for Sunday dinners, where the noise and chaos of the extended Weasley family was as comforting as it had been in Ron's childhood. One autumn evening, 20 years after Hermione had first become minister, they sat together on their porch as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and gold. The leaves were turning, painting the landscape in fire and amber. Ron's hair was more grey than red now, and Hermione's bushy curls were streaked with silver, but they held hands like teenagers, comfortable in a silence that came from decades of understanding. "Do you ever regret it?" Hermione asked suddenly. "All those years of being known primarily as my husband, of putting your own ambitions aside to support mine?" Ron considered the question seriously. It was one he'd asked himself many times over the years, and the answer had evolved as he had. "I used to worry about it," he admitted. "Used to think I was losing myself, becoming just an extension of you. But somewhere along the way, I realized that wasn't what was happening. I wasn't losing myself. I was choosing to use my strengths in a particular way. My strength was never going to be in grand gestures or political brilliance. It was in being steady, in being there, in creating a safe place for you to rest between battles." "That's not nothing," Hermione said quietly. "I know that now. It took me a while, but I know it." Ron squeezed her hand. "I made a choice, Hermione. Every day I chose to stand beside you. That was active, not passive. That was strength, not weakness. And I'm proud of that choice. I couldn't have done any of it without you. Maybe not. But that works both ways. I wouldn't be who I am, wouldn't have found my own strength, if I hadn't had to figure out how to be your partner while still being myself. We made each other better. That's what the best partnerships do." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Ron thought about the long road they'd travelled together. From that first train ride to Hogwarts, through war and peace, through obscurity and fame, through trials that had tested them in every possible way. He thought about Rose and Hugo, grown now with children of their own, carrying forward the values they'd been raised with: fairness, loyalty, the belief that blood status mattered less than character. He thought about the wizarding world that his grandchildren would inherit, so different from the one he'd been born into, shaped in part by Hermione's vision, but also by the countless people who'd supported that vision, who'd believed that change was possible. And he thought about himself, Ronald Bilious Weasley, the sixth son who'd always worried he wasn't special enough, wasn't talented enough, wasn't remarkable in any meaningful way. He understood now that he'd been looking for the wrong kind of remarkable. His gift had never been in standing out, but in standing firm, not in shining brightest, but in being the steady light that others could navigate by. "Tell me something," Hermione said, breaking the silence. If you could go back and give advice to the young man you were, the one standing in the Burrows garden on our wedding day, what would you tell him? Ron smiled, remembering that day, the nervousness, the joy, the sense of embarking on something both wonderful and terrifying. I'd tell him that the path ahead won't look anything like he expects, that there will be moments when he feels lost, when he questions his worth, when he wonders if he's enough. But I'd tell him to trust in the choice he's making, to trust that loving someone, really loving them, supporting them, standing beside them through everything, is its own form of greatness, that he doesn't need to be the hero of every story. Sometimes being the foundation that lets someone else be heroic is the most important role of all. That's beautiful, Hermione whispered. It's true. And I'd tell him one more thing. Ron turned to look at his wife, this brilliant woman who'd chosen him all those years ago and kept choosing him through everything that followed. I'd tell him that he's going to be happy, not in the simple way he imagines, but in a deeper way. The happiness that comes from living a life that matters, from raising good children, from being part of something larger than himself, from loving and being loved by someone extraordinary. Hermione's eyes filled with tears. I love you so much, Ron Weasley. I love you too, Hermione Granger Weasley. Always have. Always will. The years continued their gentle march forward. Molly and Arthur passed, peacefully, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. George, who'd carried Fred's memory for so long, finally seemed at peace with his twins' absence, finding joy in Hugo's presence at the shop, in the legacy of laughter they'd built together. Harry remained Ron's best friend, their children growing up together, their bond as strong as it had been when they'd first met on that Hogwarts Express. Ron's legacy, when people spoke of it, was quieter than Hermione's. There were no laws named after him, no sweeping reforms that bore his signature. But there were other things, the community Quidditch programs he'd helped build, bringing sport and joy to underprivileged magical communities. The outreach initiatives that had helped bridge the gap between ministry officials and ordinary witches and wizards. The shop that continued to bring laughter and lightness to a world that needed both. And there was the private legacy, the children he'd raised with love and steadiness, the grandchildren who knew they were cherished, the wife who'd been able to change the world because she had a safe harbour to return to. In the end, dear listener, Ron Weasley's story was not one of grand adventure or political triumph. It was a story of choice, the choice to love fully, to support completely, to be present and steady and true, even when the world called for flashier virtues. It was the story of a man who learned that strength comes in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest magic is simply showing up day after day for the people you love. And so our tale draws to a close, as all tales must. Ron and Hermione grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year, their partnership as strong at 70 as it had been at 20. They left the world better than they'd found it, not just through Hermione's political achievements, but through the family they'd built, the values they'd instilled, the quiet example they'd set of what true partnership looks like. Sleep now, dear listener. Let this story settle into your dreams, like autumn leaves drifting to rest. Know that the measure of a life is not in fame or glory, but in love, given and received, in steadfast presence, in the choice to stand beside someone through storm and sunshine alike. The magic of Ron and Hermione's love endures still, carried forward by their children and grandchildren, by the world they helped reshape. by every person who chooses partnership over pride, love over ego, steadfast support over fleeting glory. Rest peacefully, and may your own life be blessed with such love, such purpose, such quiet strength. The story is complete, the journey is done, and in the gentle darkness all is well.